In a luxurious house on a quiet street, behind white walls and glass windows, everything looked immaculate. The scent of freshly cut tulips, a baby cradle left by the floor-to-ceiling doors, and a table set for two. The day before, a couple from Dubai had wired the final installments, $200,000 in total, for the birth of a child via a surrogate. In the morning, the housekeeper found the spouses unresponsive in the kitchen and the living room. The infant was sleeping in the next room. At first glance, it looked like a sudden medical catastrophe. But in a home governed by routines and security protocols, true accidents are rare. The police quickly found the invisible seam of this story, a pot of wonderfully fragrant rice and spices cooling on the stove, and notes on the phone of the woman who had cooked their meals for years. Thus began a case where the dream of a family collided with greed, and care with calculation. She grew up in rooms that softened sound. Silk carpets swallowed footsteps, and tall windows made noon look like a magazine spread. Her last name opened doors long before she learned to introduce herself properly. Tutors came and went like seasons, leaving certificates that were filed away with travel itineraries and donation receipts. Money, for her, was not a project. It was the air system, always on, rarely noticed. What she wanted was simpler than her surroundings: stability, love, and the ordinary relief of a child's laughter in a quiet house. Her parents believed in structure the way others believe in luck. They curated people and places as carefully as they collected art, swapping cities without losing the rhythm of their schedule. She internalized the choreography: thank the driver, answer the board member, remember the anniversary of a foundation gala. Beneath the polish was sincerity that never learned to be loud. She was generous without spectacle and disciplined without drama. Those habits would later look like strength, and then like a fragile script that the world refused to read. He did not arrive from scarcity, but from another kind of weather. His father measured worth in outcomes and offered comfort only after performance. A childhood injury turned hospitals into long corridors of fluorescent vows: get better, get tougher, do not ask for help. He learned to accept praise with caution and criticism without argument. Control became a practice before it became a profession. It worked in board rings and, for a while, in his private life. If her world taught her that resources are constant, his taught him that stability must be secured daily. He checked locks twice, plans 3 times, and instinctively mapped exits in public spaces. Friends called him reliable because they never saw him drop what he carried. He smiled without giving away inventory. When they met, his reserve felt like an anchor to her, and her warmth felt like a place he had not yet allowed himself to inhabit. 2 different trainings recognized each other and decided to negotiate. They met at a gathering designed to look effortless: a courtyard, measured lighting, conversation that hovered above numbers without leaving them. She noticed how he listened before he answered. He noticed how she paid attention without needing to be the center of attention. Introductions were exchanged, then follow-up invitations, then a sequence of dinners that felt more like agreements than performances. They moved quickly because nothing felt forced, and slowly because both knew the cost of mistakes. The wedding was precisely arranged and publicly understated. Photographs caught what the script demanded: rings, vows, symmetry. Privately, they began building a routine that suited them better than spectacle. Work had its calendar, home its rituals. They traveled less than people anticipated and hosted more than they planned. In place of novelty, they chose repetition and found comfort there. Their house was a design of intention. Light fell where light should, noise receded where noise would normally collect, and the kitchen operated like a well-run studio. She maintained the social architecture: notes to friends, gifts dispatched on time, causes supported without announcement. He handled the contracts, the maintenance, the layer of safety that makes a home feel completed rather than merely expensive. Staff stayed because standards were clear and wages arrived early. In this order, even surprise became a scheduled category. Wanting a child turned a quiet wish into a multi-year project. They did not dramatize setbacks, but setbacks kept their own ledger. Appointments began to populate Thursdays, then Mondays, then the space between. Words like protocol and viability entered their kitchen vocabulary, trimmed of emotion and dusted with hope. They did not argue, they adjusted. Grief learned to dress as composure and leave politely before guests arrived. The first loss rearranged furniture they did not move. They kept working and kept showing up, but the cadence changed. Her optimism tightened into planning. His planning unfolded into vigilance. Friends described them as brave because they did not stop. Doctors described them as compliant because they followed every instruction. Neither label helped at night, when the house amplified the ordinary quiet between two people listening for a sound that was not yet scheduled to exist. They pursued second opinions, then third, without seeking a narrative that blamed either one. The medical file thickened while their public calendar thinned. In a life designed to minimize risk, they discovered a category with no hedge. She marked cycles on a private calendar and rewarded herself with ordinary errands when numbers dipped. He read research he pretended not to read and asked precise questions that came back with imprecise answers. Hope, in that season, was a practice more than a feeling. By the time the last recommended attempt concluded without the outcome they wanted, they were experts in patience and logistics. They did not speak about giving up, they spoke about adjusting scope. If a door is locked by statute, you look for a corridor that is legal and humane. Their country's laws were explicit, and their desire to comply was not oppose. They began to map alternatives with the same discipline they brought to everything else: measure, verify, decide. On paper, the plan looked feasible. In life, it would ask more than documents could hold. The legal map was the first constraint they drew. Their country's statutes were unambiguous, and their lawyers repeated the same sentence in different ways. Certain paths were closed, regardless of intent or resources. They treated the issue as they treated every high-stakes decision. Separate the moral question from the legal one, then see if a compliant route exists beyond the border. Options appeared in jurisdictions with regulated programs, structured contracts, and established clinics. But each option multiplied variables they usually controlled: distance, discretion, timelines, and the risk of strangers carrying their most private hope. They built a grid that looked like an operations plan. Columns for jurisdictions, clinics, success rates, oversight bodies, interim housing, and document chains. Rows for cost, duration, medical criteria, and what no spreadsheet can guarantee: trust. They were not searching for a service, they were searching for a relationship that would survive pressure. The more they read, the clearer it became that anonymity was the weakest link. The strongest link, paradoxically, would be someone they already knew. The idea arrived not as a brainstorm, but as a recognition. In a house where nearly everything had been optimized, one human constant had been faithful and steady: the woman who had cooked for them for years. She had a way of making ordinary meals feel deliberate and safe, a way of listening without prying. They knew her rhythms, her reliability, her preference for cash transfers that landed when they were supposed to. They knew, too, that she had family back home and that money traveled farther in her village than it did in their city. They approached her without ceremony, in the same kitchen where she had memorized their preferences. They did not speak in euphemisms. They explained the situation plainly and acknowledged the law. The offer was not a number, it was a structure: medical care, housing, a stipend scaled to milestones, and an aggregate sum that would change her family's horizon. She listened with the same stillness she used when they requested a change in a recipe. When they finished, she asked for time, which they granted before they had the chance to over-explain. Due diligence did not pause for courtesy. They retained counsel in the selected jurisdiction, vetted a clinic with a compliance history that could survive audit, and confirmed the chain of custody for every document from consent to discharge. The clinic's coordinator outlined medical criteria in clipped emails and insisted on psychological screening as part of the protocol. They agreed immediately. Screenings reduce avoidable surprises. Parallel to the medical path, a separate file grew: visas, housing leases, insurance riders, and a private security brief that handled the unglamorous limits of safety. When she returned to the conversation, she arrived with conditions that were neither impulsive nor naive. She wanted written guarantees, not verbal assurances. She wanted stage payments that matched medical milestones rather than a single sum at the end. She wanted a clause for emergency support to her family if complications arose, and independent access to the clinic's caseworker. They recognized the professionalism in her ask and accepted each point without bargaining. The clinic's intake began with baselines and verifications: blood work, imaging, infectious disease panels, nutritional assessments, and a review of prior pregnancies. The counselor's interview was practical rather than probing, measuring comprehension of risk and the ability to adhere to instructions under stress. She answered without embellishment and did not perform gratitude. The coordinator's notes, when relayed to the couple, were concise: she understands the protocol and is likely to comply. Housing was not an afterthought, but a pillar of the plan. They leased an apartment with good light and quiet rooms close to the clinic, stocked it with the kind of things people forget during medical seasons, and built a calendar that did not assume perfection. She would rest there, but their home would remain her workplace until medical timelines dictated otherwise. A driver familiar with both addresses would handle transport to appointments. The couple insisted on weekly check-ins that sounded casual and read like audits. On paper, the financial structure was generous. The aggregate figure was high by any local standard, with bonuses tied to health markers that mattered for mother and child. There were provisions for nutrition, incidentals, and caregiver respite, administered through a third-party accountant to prevent friction. She acknowledged the terms with a signature that matched the careful block letters in her grocery lists. The first transfer landed within the hour, just as their salaries always landed for the people on payroll. The consent meeting at the clinic formalized what all three parties already understood. The physician described steps in unemotional language, and the lawyer translated legal terms into ordinary speech without reducing their weight. Everyone signed slowly, each initial placed where decades of precedent required it to be placed. It did not feel celebratory. It felt like turning a key in a door that had resisted for years and hearing, finally, the internal bolt slide. In the weeks that followed, procedure replaced speculation. Schedules formed their own logic: medications, monitoring, brief calls to confirm what the lab had already confirmed. The couple adjusted their lives to the cadence of checklists, the way they always had, only now the checklists measured something too delicate to name out loud. She adjusted her days to instructions that were precise enough to be followed without interpretation. In that shared quiet, the plan held, not because hope made it easy, but because each person did exactly what the page required. The protocol worked the way good plans do, quietly, in increments. Lab numbers rose where they should and stayed flat where caution demanded stability. The coordinator's updates were brief, almost formulaic, and that predictability calmed everyone involved. The apartment felt lived in without feeling personal, stocked with plain foods and the sort of soft clothes people reach for when they are told to rest. She followed the lists taped to the fridge as though they were recipes, measuring time and intake with care. The couple responded with the same rigor, turning anxiety into logistics and waiting into work. The first trimester taught them a language of relief. Nausea announced itself on schedule and left when it was supposed to, and the clinic did not seem alarmed by anything it observed. She arrived early to every appointment and left with her copies of the numbers, which she filed in a folder that never left her bag. He read the summaries as if they were quarterly reports, highlighting only where the doctor told him to look. She read them differently, combing for patterns that felt like safety. Between them, a kind of professional trust formed, precise but not warm. They maintained the separation the contract implied. At home she was staff, at the apartment she was a patient, and in the clinic she was a participant in a medical process with defined rights and limits. The couple were careful to thank her without pulling her into their private hopes, and she was careful to be courteous without appearing dependent. Money moved along predetermined paths, stage by stage, leaving little room for misunderstanding. Gifts were regulated into categories that would not confuse the ledger: groceries, vitamins, ride credits. Everyone understood that clarity was the only kindness that would survive stress. When the scan revealed a boy, the news spread through the house not as a shout, but as a compression of air. The nursery, which had been a diagram for years, took on color and weight. She watched the changes the way a person watches weather, attentive, a little remote, positioned under the same sky but on different ground. The couple kept their voices level, but the new purchases betrayed a relief strong enough to leak through discipline. At the apartment, she sat longer by the window after appointments, letting the knowledge settle into a shape. In her calls home, that detail landed with a mixture of pride and arithmetic. Small requests started as ordinary bridge work across an unequal distance. School fees came due earlier than expected, and a medicine for her mother had risen in price. She asked for help in phrases that did not presume, and the couple responded in ways that did not set new precedent. The accountant processed one-time transfers and flagged the file with a note about compassion within policy. Nothing broke, nothing bent too far. But repetition turned exceptions into pattern, and patterns changed the way people read the same line. The apartment taught her the contours of their lives as surely as the house had. Deliveries arrived with a steadiness that suggested planning more than indulgence, but the categories still accumulated into a picture of scale. She did not resent their resources so much as recalibrate what life-changing meant when measured beside them. $200,000 looked large on paper and small against a horizon of assets that did not flicker under stress. She did the math the way anyone in her position would, moving columns around until the totals matched what felt fair. Numbers rarely obey feelings, and that disobedience can sound like disrespect. The clinic shifted her diet for the second trimester, and with it, the cadence of her days. Food became more frequent and less varied, and the kitchen at the apartment began to feel like a workstation rather than a room. The couple offered a part-time helper to reduce her load, which she declined with a politeness that sounded like pride. She insisted she could manage, and for a while she did. At night, she messaged home with photos of receipts, proof that money was moving as promised. Proof is a comfort when trust is an at-will agreement. As appointments grew more technical, the conversations grew narrower. Everyone avoided speculative language on purpose, and the discipline reduced friction the way a well-chosen oil reduces heat. She noted that the couple never missed a clinic call, even when travel would have excused an absence. They noted that she never missed a dose, even when fatigue would have explained a lapse. Mutual reliability stacked into a tower that looked sturdy from a distance. Up close, the seams were visible to anyone who knew where to look. Late in the second trimester, her requests changed register. She stopped asking for discreet help and started speaking about the structure itself. Whether the final sum reflected the risks, whether the postnatal window could be compensated differently, whether the contract accounted for realities no consent form can fully name. The couple listened and asked for time to consult counsel, refusing to negotiate on the fly. The clinic reminded everyone that altering incentives mid-protocol destabilizes compliance. She accepted the answer publicly and kept her counsel private. Acceptance and agreement are not always synonyms. The house absorbed the tension, because houses like this are built to absorb disruptions. Staff schedules kept their shape, deliveries continued, and the nursery filled at the same slow pace as before. She moved between spaces with the economy of someone who knows where every switch is. The couple kept the tone kind and the boundaries clear, issuing thanks that sounded genuine and limits that sounded final. In the apartment, she began to write lists that did not belong to the clinic's folder. Lists have a way of making thought feel like strategy. By the start of the third trimester, fatigue simplified everyone's choices. The plan asked for endurance rather than enthusiasm, and endurance is a language all three already spoke. She marked days by appointments and nights by the intervals between them. They marked days by deliveries and nights by the small noises a future makes when it is close enough to hear. On the surface, the structure held as designed. Beneath it, calculations accumulated in private. Hers about value, theirs about risk. Each line item neat, each total unresolved. The delivery unfolded the way a well-rehearsed procedure should. Admissions were swift, consents already mirrored in the clinic's files, monitors tracing a steady architecture of heartbeats. Nurses moved with the contained urgency that signals competence without drama. She focused on breath and instruction, turning pain into intervals she could count. When the cry arrived, it sounded ordinary and therefore miraculous. The physician narrated outcomes in neutral terms, and neutral was exactly what everyone needed. Postnatal protocols moved into place with the certainty of a checklist. The boy scored as expected, the pediatrician signed his name where precedent required, and the discharge timeline aligned with the plan. She was given medications and written guidance that echoed things she already knew, and the caseworker confirmed the home support window. The couple received the infant the way careful people receive something fragile. No noise, no theatrics, only attention. Photos were taken for family archives, not for public feeds. Gratitude was voiced in measured words, and logistics took over from there. Back at the house, the center of gravity shifted toward the nursery. Rooms that once displayed taste now organized themselves around function, with white noise, sterilizers, and dimmers resetting the mood of every hallway. She knew the house well enough to move quietly, and the child well enough to interpret sounds that might not have registered for anyone else. The apartment remained available, but proximity became the real currency. Night feedings were a choreography of footsteps and light, a rotation of presence that tried not to feel like dependence. Sleep was a commodity nobody hoarded successfully. In the kitchen, routines resumed with new parameters. Recipes softened, seasonings tempered, timing adjusted to a life measured in 2-hour spans. She cooked as she always had. Clean counters, labeled containers, a bias towards simplicity. The couple ate lighter than usual, out of respect for exhaustion rather than fear. To the cameras above the range, her movements described competence. To the calendar on the pantry door, her notes described a house adapting to a new organism. Small requests threaded the days, almost invisible under the fabric of care. A craving, a tea, a broth that soothed more than it satisfied. She obliged without commentary, annotating flavors the way a nurse annotates vitals. She also tracked something else, the gaps in supervision when the driver ran errands, the slivers of time between the housekeeper's departures and returns, the moments when the baby slept and the house exhaled. Planning doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just learns the rhythm of a place and waits for the quiet parts. She had learned over months how this home hid its private seams, where the camera angles overlapped and where they did not, which cupboards were accessed often and which stayed decorative, where spices sat for convenience and where they could sit without remark. She understood the pantry inventory as well as she understood her own file of lab results. Knowledge gathered slowly, like condensation on glass, each drop a small piece of a larger clarity. The evening they would later diagram began unremarkably. The pediatrician's check had gone well, and the child settled earlier than expected, as if participating in the house's need for an uncomplicated night. The couple chose comfort food over celebration, fatigue over ceremony. She prepared rice the way they liked it, washed until the water ran clear, steamed to a texture that held its shape without clinging. A simple stew simmered beside it, aromatics cut to uniform sizes, oil measured rather than poured. The table was set for two because that was the habit. What happened next does not need embellishment to feel deliberate. Ingredients were handled with a precision that would have pleased any instructor. Containers were opened and closed in the normal order, and yet one jar was not like the others. Measurement looked like habit, and habit is how most people miss the turn where routine becomes method. The pot on the back burner received what the recipe did not write down. Timing favored dispersion. Flavors favored concealment. They ate the way exhausted people eat, grateful for warmth and for the brief paradox of feeling fuller and lighter at once. Conversation took the shape of maintenance. Tomorrow's appointments, the baby's feeding intervals, a note about a delivery scheduled for morning. Nothing in their bodies warned them yet, because some signals travel later than the decision that sets them in motion. She tidied as she always did, restored order to surfaces that had borne the day's use, and glanced once at the monitor that displayed a sleeping child. In a house designed to mute chaos, everything looked the way a successful evening should. The earliest symptoms disguised themselves as fatigue, a dizziness that could belong to dehydration, a nausea that could belong to stress, a heaviness that could belong to the weeks just lived. He sat down with his phone still in his hand, drafting a message he did not send. She reached for the sink, paused, and steadied herself with the counter's edge. The night narrowed to essentials: breath, posture, the stubborn belief that rest can fix anything measured in hours. The child slept on, unaware that a different clock had started. She followed the script that any careful person would: water, a chair, the quiet calculation of whether to call for help or wait for the wave to pass. He recalculated too slowly, because patterns teach us to normalize what we've survived before. The housekeeper's code would not open the front door for hours, and the house's alarms were the wrong kind for this emergency. In homes like this, trouble usually arrives with noise, not with silence. Silence is what made the timing lethal. When morning came, routine re-entered before comprehension did. The housekeeper disarmed the panel, stepped into the foyer's cultivated cool, and walked the path she had walked 100 times. The kitchen told the story first: 2 plates, 1 pot, a table that had been cleared with care. Then the bodies told it again. The infant's monitor still blinked a steady reassurance that had outlived its purpose. Calls were made, and the house filled with the choreography of response: fast, skilled, too late. Later, the inventory would become evidence, and the evidence would become a timeline. The pot would matter, and the jar would matter, and the camera that saw everything except the angle that mattered would matter most of all. But in that morning's first hour, the only truth that counted was the one no plan could reverse. The dream that had finally crossed a threshold had slammed into a decision made in the quiet parts of a well-run house. The baby slept through it, the way babies do. The rest of the city kept time, unaware that a story had ended where it should have only turned a page. The investigation began where paramedics ended, at the kitchen. First responders photographed the room before touching anything, preserving the order of objects as a kind of sentence diagram. The pot on the back burner was cooled but fragrant, the lid placed at a neat angle that looked like habit. 2 plates held the trace geometry of a finished dinner. Utensils lay parallel, not dropped. A row of spices sat along the backsplash, 1 jar shifted farther right than the rest. Detectives marked it with a yellow tent and moved on only after the forensics techs nodded. Toxicology spoke before anyone else did. Preliminary screens hinted at a compound that does not live in household pantries, the sort that appears in case studies more than kitchens. The lab requested full-spectrum analysis and a rush on blood draws, stomach contents, and residues from the pot and ladle. Paramedics had done what they could without diluting evidence, and that restraint mattered now. By afternoon, a call confirmed a rare toxin consistent with ingestion, not inhalation or dermal exposure. The working theory narrowed from medical collapse to poison administered through food. The camera grid was comprehensive, but not omniscient. A wide-angle unit covered the stove and island, another the pantry and entry, a third the hallway that connected kitchen to nursery. Overlays showed predictable gaps, corners where a person could stand to chop or reach a jar with only hands entering frame. Footage from the evening revealed her moving as she always did: rinse, measure, stir, wipe. The couple entered and left on expected paths, never touching the stove. What the cameras did not see would need to be rebuilt from timing, touch, and trace. The timeline stabilized within hours. The pediatrician departed at late afternoon. The baby settled soon after. Dinner service began just after 8. The couple ate at the table, not in the den, which narrowed the window for exposure. Movement sensors recorded a lull at 9, when lights dimmed in the nursery and kitchen simultaneously. Around 10, 2 phones stopped registering meaningful movement. The house entered its scheduled night scene. The housekeeper's morning entry at 7:30 opened the investigation's day 1. Digital forensics treated phones like witnesses that never forget. The husband's device showed normal patterns through dinner: a short call to a contractor, a drafted message left unsent. The wife's phone recorded routine infant tracking entries that ended shortly after 9. Her device, the cook's, offered more. Search histories in the weeks prior included phrases that paired domestic tasks with medical queries. Benign enough alone, troubling in sequence. A cluster from 3 days before the deaths focused on dosages, onset times, and masking agents. Purchases mapped intention. Receipts from a neighborhood shop showed standard staples, but a second register log, cash only, documented an unlabeled additive sold under a euphemism to customers who knew to ask. CCTV from that kiosk captured her profile beneath a cap, not incriminating alone, but hard to reconcile with her usual supply chain. The kitchen inventory told the same story more quietly. A jar among familiar jars with a lid that did not match its set, its threads dusted with residue visible only under oblique light. On the inner lip, swabs picked up the same compound the lab had found in the victims. Interviews established context that evidence could not. Staff described a woman precise and punctual, a fixture in the house who rarely lingered without purpose. Friends recalled the couple's quiet generosity toward her family, transfers that arrived on time, and extra stipends during medical appointments. The accountant produced a ledger of stage payments and one-time supports, each with confirmations she had acknowledged. Yet, in her recent messages home, the tone had shifted from gratitude to grievance. The amounts, she wrote, were insult to risk, a phrase that stood out in a thread otherwise practical. Banking records filled the margin notes. In the month before delivery, 2 requests arrived asking to revisit the structure and align compensation with reality after birth. The couple forwarded both to counsel, who advised adhering to contract language until postpartum review. Their reply was polite but firm. Changes would be considered after medical clearance. Her next messages did not escalate in volume, they escalated in planning. Lists on her phone converted grievances into steps: timings, ingredients, windows when kitchen oversight thinned. When detectives sat across from her, they brought sequence rather than accusation. She acknowledged cooking that evening, following the same recipe as always, and denied introducing anything unfamiliar. When shown the kiosk footage, she said it was tea for her mother, purchased for superstition rather than chemistry. The officers did not argue, they cataloged. They asked about the jar with the mismatched lid, and she said spices are often decanted. They noted the statement and moved back to the lab report, which does not accept tradition as an alternative name for toxin. The arrest did not hinge on confession, but on convergence. Toxin in the victims matched residue on the ladle, the pot, and the jar's lip. Her device held searches about stealth and onset that tracked to the victim's decline. Cash purchases aligned with hours when she had unsupervised errands under the pretense of fresh produce. Camera gaps could not exonerate hands that the swabs had already named. The warrant was signed before the city fully woke. Her attempt to leave the country was competent but late. At the airport, the ticket was one way, purchased with cash routed through a third party who rarely bought tickets at all. A routine exit check became a secondary screening when her name tripped a private watch requested by investigators. In her bag, wrapped in kitchen cloth, lay a small vial that did not belong to any cuisine. The customs officer did not need to identify it. He needed only to record it and notify the waiting team. Back in the interview room, the story compressed to two competing frames. In one, she was a caregiver underpaid for the risks she bore, cornered by law and custom into accepting less than fairness. In the other, she was a planner who converted resentment into method, exploiting access that trust had granted. The detectives did not pick a frame. They returned to the chain that juries understand: motive, means, opportunity, timeline, verification. Each link held when pulled. By evening, the case file had the shape prosecutors prefer, a narrative that does not depend on narration. The kitchen was mapped, the purchases traced, the searches preserved, the residue matched, the money documented, the airport intercepted. The child was placed with family under a temporary order that would become permanent only after the court did what courts are designed to do. Outside, the house resumed a strange quiet. Inside the evidence locker, a jar with a mismatched lid waited under a seal, a small object that carried more weight than any speech could give it. The trial opened without spectacle, a calendar entry in a courtroom built to flatten emotion into procedure. Jury selection lasted 2 days, long enough to filter for people who could weigh grief without drowning in it. The indictment read plainly: 2 counts of murder by poisoning, 1 count of attempted flight, and a suite of ancillary charges tied to procurement and concealment. The prosecution promised a story told by objects rather than adjectives. The defense promised context, pressing the weight of inequality against the weight of the evidence. Both sides agreed to keep the infant's image out of exhibits, an act of restraint the judge endorsed. The prosecution's case moved like a ledger. A forensic toxicologist explained the compound's pathway from pot to bloodstream, mapping concentration curves that matched the victim's decline. A crime scene analyst layered photographs with annotations, where the ladle rested, how the jar's lid misaligned, what the oblique light revealed on stainless steel. The digital examiner walked the jury through search histories, timestamps, and the simple tyranny of metadata. A financial investigator translated transfers and stage payments into a timeline of motive hard to misunderstand. Nothing was theatrical. Everything was cumulative. Witnesses who had known the couple provided the human shape that graphs cannot draw. A pediatrician described the evening's normalcy in clipped, clinical sentences. The housekeeper's voice trembled only when she mentioned the child still breathing as she dialed for help. The accountant testified to extra stipends and the policy line they would not cross before postpartum review. A clinic coordinator confirmed informed consent and the boundaries of the arrangement, careful to draw the line between care and control. The portrait was not of saints, but of people consistent in duty. The defense shifted the lens to pressure. They built a scaffold of biography around the accused: children in another country, remittances that arrived as lifelines, cultural obligations that magnify every need. They critiqued the contract's asymmetry and the couple's refusal to renegotiate when the stakes were highest. They argued that the compound could have entered the food through contamination, and that camera gaps should not be treated as confession by omission. Cross-examination pressed at each joint, testing whether sympathy could loosen a bolt the lab had tightened. On rebuttal, the state returned to the chain no narrative could dissolve. The kiosk footage anchored the purchase to a date. The residue tied the jar to the pot. The victim's blood tied the pot to the deaths. The airport interception undercut theories of panic unlinked to guilt. In closing, the prosecutor avoided flourish. He assembled the links in order: motive, means, opportunity, act, aftermath, and offered the jury a structure designed to carry weight without decoration. It was a story with very little room inside for doubt. The defense's closing argued for complexity over certainty. They asked jurors to see the gray spaces between law and life, to consider how unequal arrangements distort perception of what is owed. They acknowledged poor decisions, then attempted to recast them as desperate miscalculations rather than malice. They leaned on the camera's blind angles and the absence of a direct view of poison entering food. They ended not on a theory but on a question, whether the state's neatness could coexist with the mess of survival. Deliberations lasted less than a day, long enough to honor the process, short enough to signal trajectory. Jurors requested to re-watch 2 clips and to rehear a single paragraph of the toxicology testimony about dose response. When they returned, the foreperson's voice carried the neutral cadence the court requires. Guilty on all principal counts. The judge thanked them for their service and released them from a story that would continue for everyone else. Sentencing was scheduled for a separate hearing to allow victim impact statements and pre-sentence reports. At sentencing, the courtroom held a different quiet. A relative spoke about the couple in sentences that refused melodrama, competence, steadiness, the ordinary kindness of reliability. The clinic coordinator, permitted a brief statement, reflected on safeguards and the gap between protocol and human choice. The defense presented letters from her village, each one a document of need and gratitude that did not reach as far as the act had. The judge listened without interruption, then read the findings on aggravation and mitigation. The law's arithmetic followed. The term imposed was long and layered. Consecutive sentences for the 2 deaths, with additional time for the flight and procurement charges, all within statutory limits. There was no parole eligibility for a span that turned years into something indistinguishable from permanence. The court ordered restitution, limited by what restitution can be, directed toward estate expenses and a trust for the child's care. No one pretended money could balance anything. The order was an accounting entry that acknowledged reality without repairing it. Custody of the infant transferred from temporary guardianship to a permanent arrangement vetted by family court. The order prioritized continuity, medical coverage, and a circle of adults already known to the child. Reports would be filed at intervals long enough to avoid intrusion and short enough to catch drift. The house itself was sold quietly, proceeds routed through an estate plan assembled for different contingencies. Objects dispersed, the nursery's contents moved without ceremony to a place where utility could replace symbol. The case closed with a moral that did not require moralizing. Surrogacy is a structure built from law, medicine, and trust. Remove any leg and the table tips. Contracts cannot outrun character, and character buckles under certain pressures unless given transparent relief valves. Inequality explains context. It does not excuse conversion of access into harm. The lesson argued for better rules and clearer floors beneath those who carry others' futures for a fee. It also argued for the simple vigilance that refuses to confuse proximity with safety. In the end, the record held what records can: dates, exhibits, orders, chains of custody, a docket number that will outlive the people who appear under it. Outside the building, traffic resumed its indifferent pace. Inside a different home, a child learned to sleep to a new set of household sounds. That is how these stories finally move, out of headlines and into routines, where the cost is measured not in closing arguments, but in breakfast, in nap schedules, in the unglamorous work of undoing what cannot be undone. The court adjourned. The consequences did not.